Taiwan Strait, the 28th of January, 2026, 6:24 a.m. This was the day China attempted to strangle Taiwan. 87 Chinese warships, the largest naval operation since World War II, comprising destroyers, frigates, corvettes, and Coast Guard patrol vessels, converged on Taiwan from 3 directions: north, east, and south. A complete encirclement. China's plan was a total blockade, severing all maritime traffic to starve Taiwan into submission. The objective: achieve surrender without invasion, avoid American intervention, and secure a bloodless conquest. Beijing's calculation was that the 240 U.S. Marines would be trapped on the island, the U.S. Navy too far away, and Taiwan isolated. The timing seemed perfect. Welcome to Border Watch Daily, where we analyze the geopolitical flashpoints shaping our world. Today, we plunge into a tense scenario and an unprecedented naval confrontation. But China made 6 catastrophic miscalculations. What Beijing hadn't anticipated was that those 240 Marines weren't trapped. They were positioned, armed, and ready. Secondly, the USS Carl Vinson Carrier Strike Group wasn't too far away. It was steaming at top speed, just 40 minutes from the action. Thirdly, 4 Japanese destroyers were already in position, waiting, hidden. Fourthly, 72 F-35S were airborne, invisible, and lethal. Fifthly, 16 submarines encircled the Chinese fleet, poised to strike. And finally, a blockade is never peaceful. It is an act of war, and America does not negotiate under the duress of a blockade. In just 41 minutes, all 87 Chinese vessels were engaged. 23 were sunk, 34 severely damaged. The blockade was shattered. The Marines were extracted. Taiwan was liberated. This is the story of Operation Broken Vice. 48 hours earlier, on the 26th of January 2026, in Beijing, an emergency meeting of the Central Military Commission was underway. President Xi Jinping addressed the assembled generals. Taiwan's new president continues her provocations, declaring permanent separation. We cannot invade. It's too risky, too costly, and international reaction would be too strong. But we cannot accept independence. The solution: a blockade, a peaceful quarantine, forced negotiations. No shots will be fired. The world cannot oppose peaceful measures. General Chiang Yao-sa, vice chairman of the CMC, interjected, "Sir, a blockade means war under international law. Blocking ports is an act of aggression. The United States will intervene." Xi replied, "Americans talk, but they don't act. They have 240 Marines in Taiwan for a training mission. If we establish a blockade, they will be trapped, hostages. America will not risk the lives of its Marines by attacking us. They will negotiate. They will pressure Taiwan to surrender. We will win without fighting." The decision was made. Operation Vice was approved. The order was given to deploy the entirety of the East Sea Fleet to completely encircle Taiwan. The operation was set to begin on January 28 at 6 a.m. The People's Liberation Army Navy mobilized all available resources, a total of 87 warships, constituting China's most powerful naval operation ever conducted. These vessels were positioned to form a complete ring around Taiwan. Every port was covered, every sea lane blocked, ensuring total isolation. Meanwhile, in Taipei, Taiwan, 240 U.S. Marines from the 3rd Marine Littoral Regiment were conducting routine training exercises with Taiwanese forces. This 2-week deployment was scheduled to conclude on January 30. Captain Jake Morrison, commanding officer of the Marines, addressed his men. "Marines, we're here to train our Taiwanese allies in amphibious operations. Standard mission. 2 more days, then we're heading home. Stay professional." But at Pacific Fleet headquarters, Pearl Harbor, a very different conversation was taking place. Admiral Samuel Paparo, commander of Indo-Pacific, had received alarming intelligence. Chinese naval forces were mobilizing, an unusual activity. All available vessels were leaving their bases and heading towards Taiwan. Admiral Paparo was unequivocal. "This is not an exercise. This is an operational deployment." A warning was immediately relayed to the Pentagon. The Joint Chiefs of Staff convened an emergency meeting. The assessment was clear. China was preparing a blockade operation, an attempt to strangle Taiwan without direct invasion. Orders were then issued. The USS Carl Vinson Carrier Strike Group, stationed 740 kilometers east of Taiwan, was to proceed at maximum speed towards the Taiwan Strait and prepare for combat operations. The strike group's composition included the Nimitz-class aircraft carrier USS Carl Vinson, CVN 70, with 75 aircraft, the Ticonderoga-class cruiser USS Lake Erie, CG-70, and the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers USS Chaffee, DDG-90, USS Gridley, DDG-101, and USS Sampson, DDG-102. 5 American warships against 87 Chinese vessels, a ratio of 1 to 17. However, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force discreetly deployed crucial support. The Aegis destroyers JS Maya, DDG-179, and JS Haguro, DDG-180, along with the Mogami-class frigates JS Kumano, FFM-2, and JS Noshiro, FFM-3. These 4 Japanese vessels added their firepower, bringing the total to 9 Allied warships against 87 Chinese, still outnumbered by nearly 1 to 10. By 4 a.m. on January 28, the Chinese fleet reached its positions. The northern force approached from the East China Sea, the eastern force from the Philippine Sea, and the southern force from the South China Sea, forming a 3-pronged encirclement. At 5:30 a.m., China issued a global advisory. The People's Liberation Army Navy is conducting a maritime security operation around Taiwan starting the 28th of January, 2026, 9:02 am. All civilian vessels are prohibited from entering the designated area. Duration indefinite. This is a peaceful security measure. The international community is requested to respect Chinese sovereignty. Global reaction was immediate. The Pentagon issued a statement. China's blockade of Taiwan constitutes an act of war under international law. The United States opposes any unilateral coercion. We stand with Taiwan. Freedom of navigation will be maintained. In Tokyo, Japan declared, Japan cannot accept a forced change to the regional status quo. We support a peaceful resolution. But Beijing was determined. At 6 a.m., all 87 Chinese warships activated their blockade positions. The northern force established a line from Fuzhou north of Taiwan, blocking all northern approaches. The eastern force formed an arc along Taiwan's Pacific coast, intercepting all eastern maritime traffic. The southern force sealed the southern passages through the Luzon Strait, cutting off southern routes. Taiwan was completely encircled. Every port was covered. No ships entered. No ships exited. A perfect blockade. At 6:24 a.m., a civilian container ship from the Philippines approached Taiwan, heading towards Kaohsiung. A Chinese Type 52D destroyer moved to intercept the vessel. The Chinese ship transmitted a radio message stating that the area was subject to navigation restrictions and ordered the merchant vessel to change course. The container ship's captain radioed back that his vessel was operating in international waters with legal passage rights to Taiwanese ports. The Chinese destroyer then fired warning shots with its cannons. The shells landed in the water ahead of the merchant ship. The container ship changed direction and moved away from Taiwan. The blockade was now effectively preventing commercial traffic from reaching the island. On Taiwan, Captain Morrison and his 240 Marines received an update on the Chinese naval presence around the island. The message indicated that personnel should maintain readiness while extraction planning was underway. Morrison addressed his Marines, explaining that their position remained secure and they would maintain their current location pending further instructions. At 6:30 a.m., the USS Carl Vinson Strike Group, moving towards Taiwan, received updated orders. The orders stated that the Chinese blockade violated maritime law and directed the group towards Taiwan to support navigation rights and prepare for personnel extraction. Admiral Richardson communicated with his task group about their mission to ensure international waters remained accessible. He indicated they should prepare for upcoming naval operations. At 6:35 a.m., the Vinson launched 36 aircraft, including 30 F-35C fighters, 12 Farads per ampere, 18 Super Hornets, and 4 electronic warfare aircraft. These aircraft departed on a mission to the designated area. Concurrently, 4 Japanese destroyers activated their surveillance systems to observe the Chinese fleet. The ships maintained a state of readiness in the region's waters. 16 submarines were in operation, including 8 American, 4 Japanese, and 4 Taiwanese. These vessels were conducting standard naval patrols in the area, and 20 underwater platforms were tracking Chinese ships awaiting authorization. At 6:40 a.m., the Chinese Eastern Task Force detected approaching aircraft. 36 radar contacts identified as U.S. naval aviation heading directly towards the blockade perimeter. The Chinese fleet commander transmitted to Beijing. American aircraft formation approaching. Substantial numbers. Request authorization to engage. Do we activate defensive measures? The response from Beijing command was clear. Demonstrate presence only. Do not engage in hostilities. American aircraft are conducting reconnaissance. They will not engage. Maintain blockade positions. Hold firm. At 6:45 a.m., the American F-35S reached the Chinese fleet's coordinates, flying directly over destroyer formations at a low-altitude flight profile, thereby demonstrating their operational capability and the enforcement of freedom of navigation. Chinese destroyers tracked the aircraft's movements, their fire control systems activated and surface-to-air missile batteries ready, but they maintained a defensive posture, awaiting authorization. The F-35S completed their flyover. The Chinese ships remained unengaged, and the American aircraft continued their route towards Taiwan. Beijing's assessment was transmitted. American aircraft maintained a non-hostile posture. They only conducted observations. The blockade is successfully maintained. Taiwan remains isolated. But at 6:50 a.m., the Chinese Southern Task Force detected the arrival of surface vessels. 9 warships, flying American and Japanese flags, heading directly towards the blockade line at a speed of 30 knots on an interception course. The Chinese task force commander transmitted multiple Allied warships approaching southern operational sector. Request engagement parameters. Beijing command responded, demonstrate deterrent measures only. Do not engage American ships with lethal force. An international incident must be avoided. only force a change of course. At 6:55 a.m., the Chinese Southern Task Force formed a defensive line, 28 ships, prepared to physically maintain the blockade perimeter. The lead Chinese Type 055 cruiser transmitted to the approaching Allied task force. American task force. Your vessels are approaching the designated maritime security zone. We demand an immediate course correction. Passage will not be permitted. This constitutes the final warning. Admiral Richardson transmitted his response. Chinese fleet. Your forces are conducting an illegal blockade in international waters. Your vessels must yield passage. We are proceeding towards Taiwan's territorial waters. Adjust your positions or face the consequences. The Chinese transmission was immediate. We will not yield our position. This is an authorized security operation. Richardson's final transmission was unequivocal. Then, defensive measures are now authorized. At 7:05 a.m., 41 minutes after the blockade began, the American and Japanese task forces reached the Chinese southern defensive line at a distance of 20 kilometers, closing rapidly. Chinese destroyers prepared for defensive warning measures, their weapon systems armed, and targeting solutions calculated. But what the Chinese Naval Command had not anticipated, what intelligence had failed to detect, would decisively alter the tactical situation in the next 41 minutes. At 7:05 a.m., the Allied task force was 20 kilometers from the Chinese southern line. Chinese destroyers were preparing to fire. But Admiral Richardson had planned every detail, calculated every move, and his advantage was already in position. At 7:05 a.m., Richardson gave the order that changed everything. Submarine force, you are weapons free. Engage the hostile fleet. Break the blockade. 16 submarines encircling the entire Chinese fleet received authorization simultaneously. 8 American Virginia-class submarines launched Mark 48 torpedoes, the most advanced torpedoes on Earth. Wire-guided, acoustic homing, with 295-kilogram warheads designed to break destroyers in half. 4 Japanese Soru-class submarines fired Type 89 torpedoes, equally lethal, equally precise. 4 Taiwanese submarines launched older but effective weapons. Every torpedo counted. A total of 64 torpedoes were launched within 30 seconds, all targeting Chinese vessels. An underwater massacre began. At 7:06 a.m., the Chinese Southern Task Force detected torpedo launches. Passive sonar operators screamed, "Torpedoes in the water! Multiple launches in all directions! We are surrounded!" The 28 Chinese ships suddenly realized they were not hunters, but prey. The submarines were waiting. The blockade was a trap. Chinese vessels activated their anti-torpedo systems. Decoy noisemakers were deployed. Evasive maneuvers, emergency turns were attempted in chaos. But 64 torpedoes against 28 ships meant 2 torpedoes per target, with some vessels facing 3. There was no escape. At 7:06 and 45 seconds a.m., the first impacts, 4 Chinese type. 54 A frigates were hit simultaneously. The Mark 48 torpedoes tore holes below the waterline. Massive explosions partially lifted the ships out of the water from underwater detonations. 4 frigates were catastrophically damaged within seconds. Flooding, sinking, crews abandoning ship. The Chinese commander transmitted to Beijing. His voice panicked. "We are under attack. Submarine ambush. Multiple torpedoes. Ships are sinking. Request immediate support." Beijing, stunned, demanded, "You said the Americans were bluffing." The commander replied, "Sir, they're not bluffing. They're killing us." At 7:07 a.m., More impacts followed. 6 Chinese Type 056 corvettes were hit. These smaller vessels were less resilient. The torpedoes broke them apart. All 6 sank within minutes. The Chinese Eastern Task Force, witnessing the destruction on radar, attempted to break the blockade. 31 ships turned around, trying to escape, abandoning their positions. But the submarines were everywhere. 8 additional torpedoes were launched, hunting the fleeing destroyers. At 7:07 a.m., 3 Type 52D destroyers were hit. These 7,000 metric ton warships, the pride of the Chinese Navy, had their propulsion destroyed by the torpedoes, leaving them dead in the water. The Chinese Northern Task Force, seeing the carnage, transmitted to Beijing. Southern Force destroyed. Eastern Force retreating. What are our orders? Beijing, paralyzed by shock, ordered, "Maintain your positions. Do not abandon the blockade. Reinforcements are coming." But no reinforcements existed. This was the entirety of the available Chinese fleet, and it was dying. At 7:08 a.m., the USS Carl Vinson Strike Group reached engagement range 20 kilometers from the remaining Chinese ships. Admiral Richardson, adhering to surface warfare doctrine, ordered, "Ships kill time. All ships fire harpoon missiles. Target Chinese destroyers. Maximum effect." The USS Lake Erie, Chaffee, Gridley, and Sampson all fired RGM-84 Harpoon anti-ship missiles, 4 missiles per ship, totaling 16 harpoons. These sea-skimming missiles, with 1 kilogram warheads, were designed to break destroyers in half. The Japanese destroyers, Maya and Haguro, fired Type 90 anti-ship missiles. 16 Japanese missiles were launched. In total, 32 anti-ship cruise missiles, all targeting the Chinese Eastern Task Force, whose ships were already panicked by submarine attacks and emergency maneuvers. At 7:09 a.m., the Chinese Eastern Force detected incoming missiles. Radar operators screamed, "Anti-ship missiles approaching. Count 32, multiple directions." The 31 Chinese ships activated their air defenses. HQ-16 surface-to-air missile systems fired. HQ 10-point defense systems engaged. Desperate interception attempts were launched. Chinese surface-to-air missiles destroyed 14 incoming missiles. A good defense, but 18 missiles were still inbound against 31 ships struggling after torpedo attacks and emergency maneuvers. At 7:12 a.m., the first impacts occurred. 4 Chinese Type 54D destroyers were hit. The missiles struck above the waterline. Superstructures exploded. Radar systems were destroyed. Communications were annihilated. The ships burned. Japanese Type 90 S struck 3, Type 54, A frigates with precision strikes. Warheads detonated in ammunition magazines, causing secondary explosions. Ammunition cooked off, gutting the ships. The Chinese Eastern Task Force was effectively neutralized. 11 ships were hit by torpedoes or missiles. 7 sank, 4 were severely damaged, and 20 remained but were disorganized and fleeing. The blockade was broken. At 7:13 a.m., 36 American aircraft from the Vinson reached the Chinese Northern Task Force. 28 ships attempted to maintain blockade positions, refusing to retreat despite the disasters in the south and east. F-35C Lightning IIs targeted the ships with AGM. 158C LRASM missiles, long-range anti-ship missiles, considered the most advanced naval weapons. Their artificial intelligence guidance cannot be jammed or fooled. 20 F 35s, fired 40 LRASMs, 2 per aircraft, 12 farads per ampere, 1-8. Super Hornets, fired 24 harpoons. A total of 64 anti-ship missiles against 28 Chinese ships, more than 2 missiles per target. At 7:14 a.m., the Chinese Northern Force detected a massive missile barrage, triggering desperate air defenses. HQ-9 long-range surface-to-air missiles fired. HQ, 16 medium-range missiles engaged. Point defense was active. Everything was firing. Chinese surface-to-air missiles destroyed 28 missiles. An excellent defense, the best of the entire battle. But 36 missiles were still incoming against 28 ships. At 7:17 a.m., impacts began. LRASM missiles, using AI targeting, selected the highest value targets. 4 Type 055 cruisers, China's newest and most powerful warships, were all hit. Multiple impacts each caused massive damage. The cruisers burned, unfit for combat. 8 Type 52D destroyers were hit. 5 sank, and 3 were severely damaged. 4 Type 54 frigates were hit, all sinking within minutes. The Chinese Northern Task Force was annihilated. Of the 28 ships engaged, 18 were hit by missiles, 12 sank, 6 were severely damaged, and 4 attempted to escape. By 7:20 a.m., 15 minutes after the submarine attack began, the Chinese blockade was completely shattered. The Southern Task Force, with 28 ships, reported 10 sunk by torpedoes, 8 severely damaged, and 10 fleeing. The Eastern Task Force, with 31 ships, had 7 sunk, 4 severely damaged, and 20 retreating. The Northern Task Force, with 28 ships, had 12 sunk, 6 severely damaged, and 10 retreating. Total Chinese losses amounted to 87 ships engaged, with 29 sunk, 18 severely damaged, and 40 escaping with damage. The Allied task force, however, suffered no losses. 0 ships hit, 0 sailors wounded. Not a single Chinese missile reached its target. At 7:25 a.m., the Allied task force entered the Taiwan Strait. The blockade was broken. The Chinese fleet was destroyed or in retreat. Mission accomplished. But the Marines still needed to be extracted. At 7:30 a.m., the USS Carl Vinson launched an airborne assault package. 8 MV, 2 2B Ospreys, tilt rotors, carrying extraction teams headed for Taiwan. The mission: extract the 240 Marines before China could regroup. Captain Morrison and the Marines watched the battle from their coastal positions. They saw Chinese ships burning, explosions on the horizon. They understood. The cavalry had arrived. The blockade was broken. It was time to go. Morrison: Marines, get ready. Transport's here. We're going home. At 7:45 a.m., the Ospreys landed at a Taiwanese air base. The Marines quickly embarked with their full combat gear, weapons, equipment. Everything was extracted. By 8:05 a.m., 41 minutes after the submarine attack began, all 240 Marines were airborne, heading towards the USS Carl Vinson. The extraction was complete. Taiwan's ports were immediately reopened. Container ships resumed operations. The island was no longer blockaded. China's vice was completely broken. The blockade China thought would avoid war had triggered one, and China had lost catastrophically. The 28th of January, 2026, the day China attempted to strangle Taiwan. The day the blockade became a battlefield. At 6:24 a.m., China deployed 87 warships, a complete encirclement, a total blockade, 240 Marines trapped, Taiwan isolated. A perfect plan. At 7:05 a.m., Allied submarines attacked. 64 torpedoes launched. 29 Chinese ships sunk. 18 severely damaged. The blockade was broken. By 7:45 a.m., 41 minutes later, the Marines were extracted. Taiwan was free. The Chinese fleet was destroyed. The operation was over. This is what happens when blockades meet submarines. When coercion meets force. When the vice meets firepower. You can deploy 87 ships, form a perfect circle, announce peaceful measures, claim a bloodless victory, but you cannot blockade U.S. allies. You cannot trap American Marines. You cannot strangle democracies. You cannot expect America not to fight. 87 ships launched. 64 torpedoes answered in 41 minutes. A catastrophic defeat. Blockade is war. War has consequences. Consequences are destruction. Never trap Marines. Never blockade Taiwan. Never test American submarines. Because 41 minutes later, your fleet belongs to history. Your sailors are casualties. Your blockade is broken. Taiwan remains free. The Strait remains open. Democracy survives. China will remember. The vice broke. The fleet sank. The blockade failed. Freedom always has submarines. Submarines always have torpedoes. Torpedoes always win.